Okay. Okay, Iris, you're good to go now.
Thank you, Zach. So hello, everyone. Welcome to an event of the School of Materialist Research. This school is an education and research collective that offers intensive study courses, seminars, special programs, and research initiatives that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. SMR was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities Skopje, the Department for Architecture Theory and the Philosophy of Technics at TU Vienna, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven. And it serves as a global hub for education, research, and experimentation at the intersection of the humanities, social sciences, creative fields, and the STEM sciences. I will be chairing today's session. My name is Iris van der Tuin. I'm professor of theory of cultural inquiry at Utrecht University, the Netherlands. And I'm a close collaborator of Adam Nozak of ASU, Katerina Kolosova of ISSH Skopje, Vera Boelman of TU Wien, and Saskia van Stijn of the Critical Inquiry Lab. Let me welcome my colleagues and today's speaker, as well as the participants in Zoom and via YouTube. Today's talk is by Nandita Biswas Mellamphy. Professor Biswas Mellamphy specializes in critical political theory, continental philosophy, and speculative political theory, especially the work of Nietzsche, as well as the history of political thought. Particular areas of interest include posthumanism, information and digital warfare, and critical surveillance or terrorism studies. Personally, I know her from her innovative work on and translation of Gilbert Simondon. Today's talk is titled In, On, or Out of the Loop, Genders, Posthumanisms, and Technesis. Nandita, the floor is yours. I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. My name is Nandita Biswas Mellamphy, and I'm a researcher and teacher at Western University in Canada, housed on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenni Lenape. I'm honored to be invited to share some of my thoughts with you today, and I want to thank everyone at the School of Materialist Research for inviting me. I very much appreciate the mission of this school, and I'm pleased to contribute in my own meager way. I also want to thank my very excellent doctoral research assistant, Jacob Van Geest, whom I see here, for his excellent research assistance on today's presentation. Thank you so much, Jacob. And also shout out to my former graduate student and excellent theorist in her own right, Michelle Liu, whose thesis I'm going to draw upon in the present talk. Alrighty then. So today I've slightly altered the title. I'm going to call it In, On, and Out of the Loop, Gender and Standard / Non-Standard Posthumanisms. All right then, so let's begin. For almost 2 decades, my academic home has been at Western University, primarily in the Department of Political Science, but also at the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism, as well as in gender, sexuality, and women's studies. I'm primarily a theorist, although I'm happy to also be currently engaged in empirical research and the formulation of an empirical research program. But all this to say that I'm somewhat of a non-standard political theorist. I have an interdisciplinary background in politics, political theory, and the history of political thought, in the history of ideas, both ancient and modern, and in contemporary as well as ancient philosophy, as well as in the social sciences. Over the past 10 to 15 years, I've worked as an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary scholar, often in collaboration with colleagues outside of my own discipline, including designers, composers, multimedia performance artists, and science fiction and fantasy writers. I've been interested in artificial intelligence and the AI boom of the past 2 decades, and these have been fodder for much of my current research. What I've found is that AI is, to put it mildly, very paradoxical. It is both everywhere and nowhere. Everyone's talking about it. A good number are studying and developing it, but there is still, for example, no operating system like Samantha or gynoids like Ava, although we do have Sophia the robot. AI algorithms are being implemented in every sector and domain of society, from warfare to medicine and health, from digital entertainment and virtual reality gaming to life partner seeking and or casual dating. But here's the rub. AI research has focused on narrow rather than general operations of AI. With the few examples I've just invoked, Samantha, the quote unquote female OS in Jones's film Her, or Ava, the quote unquote female gynoid, or in Garland's Ex Machina, and Sophia, the quote unquote female robot developed by Hanson Robotics. It's clear that not only do critical questions about human-centrism emerge when exploring the vast and quickly growing scholarship on AI, AI ethics, AI governance, and AI design, so too do questions of sex, race, gender, and anthropomorphization. Areas of scholarship still have a long way to go in explaining and understanding, never mind challenging and overturning, the sexual, racial, gendered, and capitalist processes of humanization and dehumanization that undergird the currently human-centric paradigm of AI. While debates are emerging about ethical standards and how to assure the widest socioeconomic enjoyment of the benefits of AI across different populations, the current paradigm of human-centered AI goes largely unquestioned. In fact, leading academic institutions such as Stanford University's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence propose to align AI development with the notion of beneficial intelligence based on humanistic and human-centric values. Global discourses have emerged around meaningful human control, and philosophers claim that robots can be designed to act ethically and should have rights. Many unquestioningly continue to emphasize human exceptionalism and oversight in their proposals for AI. But is the solution simply to reaffirm humanism and humanistic principles? Generally speaking, human-centrism posits that humans should have command over non-human entities. Historically, humanistic conceptions are based on asserting the priority of humans. Non-humans are viewed as means to human ends. Theoretically, posthumanisms, especially critical feminist posthumanisms, and speculatively oriented feminisms offer, I think, a substantial basis for challenging this claim. Normative approaches to human-centered artificial intelligence as such are limited and could be enriched and expanded by thinking anew about other ways of conceptualizing human, non-human relationalities. Indeed, problematizing AI in light of post-humanistic critiques would be beneficial in confronting questions of whether non-human intelligences can be conceptualized in terms other than humanistic. So, to what extent can humans and non-humans be conceptualized in terms other than human? This question has driven my explorations of AI and helped me outline a heuristic theoretical analytic composed of 3 different diagrams of human, non-human relationality that express different degrees of human oversight. This rubric helps me to organize and consider different configurations of gender, technicity, humanisms, and posthumanisms. The first diagram is one in which humans are in the loop. In the second one, humans are on the loop. And finally, in the last diagram, humans are completely out of the loop. The rubric I develop of humans in, on, and out of the loop originally comes from robotics. This terminology has been applied to warfare, and in particular to the categorization of lethal autonomous weapon systems and the degree to which they need human supervision in making combat decisions. For instance, the use of human-in-the-loop robotic weapons, i.e. robots that can select targets and deliver force only with human command, and human-on-the-loop weapons, robots that can select targets and deliver force under the oversight of a human operator that can override its actions, are being avoided in favor of human out-of-the-loop weapon systems, robots that are capable of selecting targets and delivering force without any human input or interactions at all. Predictions are that by 2030, fully autonomous weapon systems will be commonplace, and that machine capabilities will have increased to the point that humans will have not only become the weakest component in a wide array of systems and processes, but they will fade out of the decision-making loop entirely. So here, the rubric I develop, which comes out of robotics, I intend to use the terms as heuristic and generic diagrams of control, each deploying gender in both standard and non-standard ways. So the shorthand in, on, and out of the loop is meant to invoke three different configurations of command and control. One in which the human is in control and in which relation is conceived as hierarchical. One in which the human shares control with the non-human and in which relation is conceived transversely. And one in which the human has no part in controlling and in which there is no relation. I call these heuristics diagrams rather than, say, patterns or even types qua archetypes, in order to remain suggestive and speculative rather than be prescriptive and or deterministic. A diagram is never completely individuated. Unlike a representation or a signifier, a diagram is partial and never cedes its suggestiveness. More gesture than inscription, a diagram is volatile, never foreclosed, but always oneric, open to dreams and nightmares as well. It cannot be grasped by a concept, nor does it congeal into a sign. A diagram, nonetheless, conducts itself via randomness, aporia, kairos, and metic hexis, or crafty cunning, that is, mechanisms of manipulation. For the French mathematician Gilles Châtelet, diagrams are more than representations of existing knowledge. They have the ability to capture gestures mid-flight. Quote, unlike the metaphor, the diagram is never exhausted. If it immobilizes a gesture in order to set down an operation, it does so by sketching a gesture that then cuts out another, end quote. In this sense, the tripartite analytic I present here is meant to organize propensities rather than establish a prescriptive and or teleological framework. Nevertheless, I want to suggest that this threefold schema can be insightful in identifying the anthropocentric gestures of various humanistic and post-humanistic positions on gender oppression and gender liberation, and in potentially pushing the conceptual boundaries of how to redeploy concepts of gender beyond anthropocentrism. So recently, there's been a flurry of scholarly critiques of humanism from the purview of posthumanism. According to feminist philosopher Rosi Braidotti, while the adoption of classical humanism did lead to pushes for women's liberation as human emancipation, early feminism did not undo the universalism and binary thinking that were present in classical humanism. The critique of universalism is undertaken by feminist anti-humanists and feminist post-structuralists, including some post-colonial post-structuralists. Braidotti thus brings together, on the one hand, anti-humanism's rejection of anthropocentrism, i.e. of man as a universal ideal, and on the other, post-structural feminism's critique of phallogocentrism, moving towards a post-anthropocentric, post-humanist feminism that embraces new materials and materialisms as the basis for displacing the anthropocentric politics of the so-called capitalocene. Calling for a post-humanities to develop as a humanities without the human, alongside a feminism without gender, Cecilia Osberg, building on Berdotti's account, argues that instead of the term Anthropocene, we should consider our present epoch as post-natural, that is, beyond the naturalism of the nature-culture dichotomy. In a similar vein, rejecting gender essentialism, Eldon Youngblood contends that critical feminist posthumanism, quote, endeavors to trace the notions of sex, gender, and sexuality as they traverse the borders of internality and externality, revealing their entanglement in a complex web of sociocultural meanings and biological imperatives, end quote. So while anti-humanist, post-structuralist, and posthumanist feminisms, have opened up avenues for decentering the human and embracing the non-human, many point out that they remain troubled by gender, despite their rejection of gender essentialism. In an effort to deterritorialize gender, some scholars warn that posthumanism does not posit a genderless body. Quote, sex, gender, race, sexuality are not a difference from other bodies, but rather a difference that emerges from within the individuating body as material discursive process, end quote. So instead of negating gender, such posthumanist feminisms seek to experiment and even simulate gender. So on the one hand, there are increasingly criticisms of anthropocentrism in ecological, sociological, and feminist scholarship, including posthumanism inspired challenges to the problems of the Anthropocene. And on the other hand, there is the call for more anthropocentrism and the development of quote unquote human-centered AI based on humanistic values. So this growing tension is really the theoretical context for today's exploration. I'm looking for a way of gauging just how anthropocentric certain viewpoints are, and whether some post-humanistic claims about having reached the post-anthropocentric really live up to their promise. By the end of this talk, I hope to show that despite antagonisms between these two general positions, both are more or less anthropocentric because both retain a special role for human oversight and control. In this presentation, I explore 3 diagrams of control that provide an opportunity for theoretical provocation about the limits of human-centrism for conceptualizing gender. In the first diagram of humans in the loop, or HIL, humans are distinguished hierarchically, both ontologically and epistemologically, from various categories of non-human in terms of the dialectics of master and slave, as well as of domination and subjugation. In this diagram of control, humans are imagined to be in the loop of control, justifying mastery and superiority over those who are deemed incapable of reaching full human potential. Gender is defined by the ontological superiority of humans over non-humans and institutionalized in the differences between male and female, master and slave. HIL perspectives, in the loop perspectives, are thus strongly anthropocentric, emphasizing human superiority and treating non-humans as instruments and means to achieve human ends. In the second diagram of the human on the loop, human agency is displaced and decentered in an effort to downplay human-centrism and underscore compatibilities between human animals, non-human animals, and machines. Characteristic of contemporary critical posthumanisms, binary gender is recoded as multiple, material, moving, and made to bridge divides between human and non-human. In this second diagram of control, humans reject mastery over non-humans and opt instead to distribute control and be on the loop with other species and intelligences. HOL viewpoints tend to espouse strong connectionism, emphatically endorsing co-evolution and/or co-individuation of humans and non-humans. While the relationality of on-the-loop approaches are appealing, they don't overturn anthropocentrism altogether and tend to retain normative assumptions about the special status of humans in relation to non-humans. Anthropocentrism is especially difficult to overturn completely when the intellectual resources and practices that we have come from histories that are deeply embedded in humanistic ideas that give humans a special status among other life forms. So while in theory, it may be possible to maintain conceptual distinctions between both HIL and HOL perspectives, in practice, the strict distinctions between in the loop and on the loop is hard to maintain. And ethical perspectives of every kind tend to find refuge in human-centric ideals that promise a special status and role for humans. Neither HIL nor HOL perspectives, even the more critical alternatives, can claim to have explained why humans should expect to retain their special status amongst other non-humans. The task of conceptualizing a human out of the loop, or HOOL perspective, would thus fall to speculation and speculative thinking. Therefore, I argue that conceptualizing non-anthropocentrism would fall into a distinct third model or diagram of humans out of the loop. In this HOOL diagram of control, characteristic of more speculative versions of posthumanism, human-centrism is devalued, deposed, and discarded. Here, the notion of gender is hacked and rendered alien, xeno, going beyond and before the horizon of human, non-human relationalities, disconnected from and independent of any human centrism. Any distinctions, and by extension, any relation between human and non-human would not be assumed or even sought. This, I would say, is the veritable domain of the post-anthropocentric. So having established the parameters of this analytic framework, I argue that while critical feminist-inspired posthumanisms seek to decenter and displace humanist premises by inverting the logic of dualism and colonization at their core, they remain wedded to conceptions of relationality, vitalism, and connectionism, and do not ultimately abolish the privileges of anthropos. In this regard, these critical feminist posthumanisms can be considered standard because they still retain a weak commitment to anthropocentrism. By contrast, non-standard feminist posthumanisms, for example, more speculative posthumanisms and alterfeminisms, would necessarily need to seek disconnection from human centrism and abolish the dichotomy between human and non-human. Etymologically, the word gender predates the word sex. It emerges in the 14th century as a way of designating a kind, sort, or class of persons or things sharing certain traits, and comes from the old French words gendre and genre, meaning kind, species, character, or gender, from the Latin stem genus, meaning race, stock, family, kind, rank, order, species, and also male or female sex, and from the Proto-Indo-European root jana, meaning to give birth and beget. Thinking of gender in terms of genre allows us to think of the genres of gender and their alignment to a generic diagram of control, namely A, the humanist genre of binary gender and its generic diagram of control, in which humans are central and superior to non-humans, and by extension, in which males are central and superior to females. B, the standard posthumanist genre of non-binary gender and its generic diagram of shared power between human and non-human. And finally, C, a non-standard genre in which gendered human / non-human dichotomies are abolished and made incommensurable. So by now, I hope you have an overall sense of the context, concepts, and content that I'm going to mobilize in this presentation. Now I will turn to a more detailed discussion of these diagrams of control and their deployment of gender. We begin with the humanistic genre of gender, in which humans are in the loop, HIL. I'm going to call this diagram the mastery model of strong anthropocentrism. In this diagram of mastery and subordination, as I've already alluded, humans are conceptualized as being in the loop of control, justifying superiority over those who are deemed incapable of reaching full potential. A hallmark of humanism is that it established humanity's separate and exceptional character, and purposely or not, led to the subjection of everything else to this alleged special status. Strongly anthropocentric humanism posits a theory of human nature that is used as a basis for making various normative, moral, cultural, and legal claims that elevate humans to the status of moral and political agents, while relegating non-humans to a lesser, more instrumental status. Now, humanism grounds its ethical claims in the human capacities for speech, reason, autonomy, impartiality, and universality, which are then used as justifications for mastery of and management of non-humans who are considered to lack these capabilities. In the intellectual histories of Western thought, the view that humans possess unique capacities that make them exceptional and or superior to others is often found. For instance, ancient Greek virtue ethics, medieval humanism, early modern mechanistic philosophy, and even contemporary philosophies of mind are grounded in anthropocentric terms that privilege the achievement of human ends by way of human rationality at the expense of non-human lives. Now, within this mastery model, humans govern unpredictability through the instrumentalization of their rationality and their normative and norm-making capacities. Strong human-centrism posits the achievement of human control using the instruments of reason, like technologies, and by using reason as an instrument. In the history of Western ethics, the in-the-loop portrait of control has centered on the human intellect, especially the activity of deliberating about human ends, which require mental and practical capacities to discern the worthy ends of human life. Take, for example, Aristotle's stance justifying slavery, which not only establishes the division between human and non-human, but also connects various hierarchies together, namely the human domination of nature, male domination over female, and the master's domination over the slave, as well as reason's domination of the body and emotions. Aristotle offers an account of each dualism's place in a chain of hierarchies, and I quote, "It is clear that the rule of the soul over the body and of the mind and the rational element over the passionate is natural and expedient, whereas the equality of the two or the rule of the inferior is always hurtful. The same holds true for animals in relation to men, for tame animals have a better nature than wild, and all tame animals are better off when they are ruled by man, for then they are preserved," end quote. Generally speaking, the concept of gender, inherited from the legacy of Western humanism, is thus dualistic, hierarchical, and human-centric. Philosophically and politically, this conceptual network of binaries, mind, body, reason, emotions, human, animal, male, female, freedom, slavery, all reflects the dynamics of mastery and or hierarchy, of higher over lower, superior over inferior, essential over instrumental. Historically, Humanism has portrayed the human as agent, as creator of culture and technologies, as bearer of rights and responsibilities that makes use of other life forms, both human and non-human, including plants, animals, and machines. Those who have been regarded as deficient in rationality and intrinsic moral worth, such as women, children, slaves, and colonized subjects, are deemed as lacking full potential and are treated as less than human, that is, as subhuman. Along with this objectification of the non-human and subhuman, the instrumentalization of techniques and technological manipulation become the main vehicles by which humanism perpetuates its diagram of master control. In human-centric narratives, such as the Renaissance notion of man as the measure of all things, or in modern debates about nature versus nurture, or in contemporary debates about humans versus robots, humans are framed as having special insights and being self-authorized to preside, command, and control all others. Within humanism, humans are depicted as capable of transcending their animal roots through intellection and instrumentalization of a non-human order for the benefit of all humankind. This diagram of human control, of the morally conscious modern individual that technologically transforms the non-human world for the benefit of all, is such a pervasive but unquestioned dogma that to challenge this viewpoint amounts to disrupting prevailing ways of doing, thinking, and being. Thus, the HIL diagram of control tends to conceptualize gender in human-centric terms and follows what feminist philosopher Val Plumwood has called a logic of colonization, in which difference between beings is conceived dualistically as the mastery of a superior order over an inferior one. Quote, "The upper side is an end in itself, but the underside has no such intrinsic value. It is not for itself, but merely useful, a resource. This is a model of domination and transcendence in which freedom and virtue are construed in terms of control over and distance from the sphere of nature. By means of dualism, the colonized are appropriated and incorporated into the selfhood and culture of the master, which therefore forms their identity. The dominant conception of the human-nature relation in the West has features corresponding to this logical structure," end quote. So within this diagram of mastery and hierarchy, humans are supposed to govern unpredictability through the instrumentalization of their rationality and their normative and norm-making capacities, as I already said. Liberal and normative theories of human rights are grounded in this human-centric representation of the individual who is expected to take ownership over its own self, this self-mastery thereby sanctioning the exercise of mastery over others who are incapable of such self-legislation. Even critically minded liberal thinkers like feminist Mary Wollstonecraft did not challenge the human-centric presumption regarding, quote, man's preeminence over the brute creation. Wollstonecraft writes, quote, "The perfection of our nature and capability of happiness must be estimated by the degree of reason, virtue, and humanity that distinguish the individual, and from which the exercise of reason, knowledge, and virtue naturally flow," end quote. So historically, advocacy for the rights and welfare of those deemed to lack reason, and thus considered non-rational, did emerge among liberal sentimentalists like Jeremy Bentham, who argued that non-rational people should be protected not on the basis of rational capacities and claims to freedom and equality, but rather because the non-rational have shared capacities for sentience. They are therefore owed limited human protection and sympathy. So liberal sentimentalism sought to protect individual freedom by borrowing from 19th and 20th century ideals of social equality as minimal capabilities that the state must guarantee and should also extend to non-human animals as well as people with disabilities and non-citizens. Human-centrism positions humans as being at the center of agency, cognition, and broader relations networks of exchange. Humanism does not overturn the unchallenged assumption that what makes non-humans worthy of moral consideration is their commonality, similitude, and resemblance with humans, who have a special status as moral agents. Thus, liberal concepts of human moral agency, even when they go beyond possessive individualism, tend to assess the worth of non-humans in terms of human-centric standards. By continuously deploying this in-the-loop logic and its hierarchical dynamics, the humanistic diagram centered on human moral agency fails to overturn the logic of domination and transcendence that defines prevalent conceptions of human non-human relations. Take, for example, philosophical discussions of AI ethics. Privileging processes and practices that prioritize the superiority of human moral agency, humanistic ethicists of AI continue to argue that robots should be slaves, the very definition, etymologically speaking, of robot, and never viewed as persons or companions. Joanna Bryson writes, quote, "Legal and moral responsibility for a robot's actions should be no different than they are for any other AI system. And these are the same as for any other tool. We should never be talking about machines making ethical decisions, but rather about machines operating correctly within the limits that we have set for them," end quote. Within this human-centric framework, technologies are made to remain tools of their human masters, just as the body is made to remain subservient to the mind, and just as those identified as rational are given the prerogative to rule over those deemed incapable of being rational themselves. As Paula Boddington asserts, humans have agency, especially moral agency, which is an essential attribute of humanity and what makes it distinct and valuable. Quote, "This we must not lose. Computers, even those with artificial intelligence, are our tools. They should not diminish our agency. Ideally, we should use them to enhance our agency," end quote. Against those like Boddington and Bryson, who envision robots as instrumental slaves, some liberal philosophers like David Gunkel do question whether robots, machines, non-human animals, and even extraterrestrials might be conceived as an other for which humans may be morally responsible. Like his liberal sentimentalist predecessors, Gunkel argues that humans may have moral obligations to robots based on moral patience, which is a sentimentalism-based theory that non-humans are vulnerable and are owed limited human protection and sympathy. So Gunkel writes, quote, "Developing and debating the rights of robots does not necessarily take anything away from human beings and what presumably makes us special. It offers a critical tool for doing some work in moral theory, making available new opportunities for us to be more precise and scientific about these distinguishing characteristics and their limits," end quote. So despite their obvious differences, both the classic and sentimentalist liberal positions reinforce human-centric exceptionalism. Emphasis remains on the moral problems that might occur with increasingly intelligent artificial machines and rebellious robots, and whether robots can be designed to act morally and thus serve human needs. Notwithstanding the diversity of differing ethical viewpoints, the legitimacy of human-centrism goes largely unquestioned, as does the possibility of imagining alternatives. Thus, human-centered AI tends to be strongly anthropocentric. Such HIL views prioritize the human element of oversight while pursuing whatever means necessary, including the denigration of those deemed non-human and or less than human, to achieve quote unquote desired outcomes. This is a narrative that many find appealing. Cutting-edge technologies are harnessed by the power of human ingenuity. From this perspective, AI and questions of digital automation in general are viewed in terms of human autonomy and oversight over non-humans. It's no surprise then that most applications of AI today that provoke notions of speed, quantity, flexibility, scalability, and extensity, from self-driving cars and artificial neural networks to advertising and earthquake predictions, are portrayed as giving humans the tools to control and navigate uncertainty and change. HIL perspectives privilege the production of knowledge that is human-centered, prioritizes human mastery over non-human entities, and justifies practices that entail human exceptionalism and the instrumentalization of the non-human. So within the HIL diagram of control, gender follows a logic of colonization, domination, and transcendence, defined by the patriarchal / humanistic priorities of this dominant and dominating diagram, replicating the master-slave dynamics and the politics of binary gender. Is your AI a girl or a boy? Though partly produced by this logic of colonization, the histories of feminist criticism, especially the waves of feminist thinking, praxis, and writing, have been especially important for challenging, loosening, and inverting the binary ontologies and epistemologies born out of patriarchal humanism. First wave feminisms defined and identified the gender binary at the heart of humanism and made arguments to share in the spoils of patriarchy. Here I'm thinking of Wollstonecraft, Harriet Taylor, John Stuart Mill, and participants at the Seneca Falls Conference in 1848 who were predominantly white, middle, and upper class women. But I'm also thinking of Black feminist Sojourner Truth, who at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention held in Akron, Ohio, posed the definitive question, ain't I a woman? Sojourner's challenge forces questions of race and class into the Occidental feminist agenda that would spur on a second wave of feminisms that have gone further to contest the master diagram of control by inverting the terms of the binary. No longer the domination of males, masculinity, culture over females, femininity, nature, but the other way around. What remains undisrupted and intact is the legitimacy of the master diagram of control and its intricate network of binary oppositions. The humanist genre and conception of gender is, again, thus strongly anthropocentric, leaving unquestioned the diagram of control, mastery, and subordination at its core. Terms like nature and culture collide within a complex and contested battlefield of meanings, hierarchies, and exclusions where racial, sexual, ethnic, and other differences have been cast in terms that distinguish so-called higher forms of humanity from lesser ones, deemed to lack some degree of rationality or cultivation. So the master-slave dichotomy at the heart of the humanistic version of human control reproduces a cluster of other dualisms, such as self-other, human-machine, man-woman, colonizer-colonized. This logic of mastery and subjugation views domination as natural and befitting. Within this model of control, as Val Plumwood says, the multiple complex cultural identity of the master is formed in the context of class, race, species, and gender domination. The problem, however, is that the assumptions in the master model are not seen as such because this model is taken for granted as simply the human model. In an effort to address the limits of humanism, contemporary feminist transhumanism claims to offer a post-gender and gender liberationist view that argues that through the application of neurotechnologies, biotechnologies, and assistive reproductive technologies, gendering can be eliminated and human potential can truly be realized. Transhumanism, which is a term said to have been coined in the 1950s by Julian Huxley to mean the transitional human who is moving beyond its human limits, is a movement that seeks to transform humans through technological augmentation in order to invert the humanistic hierarchy of human over machine and thus liberate humans from gender oppression. Sometimes touted as fourth wave feminists defined by technology and even post-feminists, feminist transhumanists retain the first wave feminist assumption that mind is a superior path to liberation than body, which is inferior and limiting, and that technology is the instrument, the means towards the end of transforming the human. So retaining the humanist dualism favoring liberation through mastery, technological progress, and exceptionalism, the transhumanist argument for gender liberation ultimately and ironically affirms the humanist diagram of control. Indeed, scholars have emphasized the deep compatibilities and connections between transhumanism and liberal feminism, with intellectual roots in Enlightenment positivism and rationalism and technological progressivism. So like its historical predecessor, liberal sentimentalism, transhumanism shares with liberal feminism a deep commitment to universality framed as the well-being of all sentience. It is the shared capacity to feel in this case, and not to the capacity to think rationally, that undergirds this brand of sentimentalist transhumanism. As James Hughes argues in his book, Citizen Cyborg, quote, persons don't have to be human, and not all humans are persons, end quote. In other words, some transhumanists are happy to anthropomorphize non-humans while at the same time denying personhood to some humans. What started out as discontent with some of the limitations within classical humanism has paved the way, ironically, for a position from which to turn back to humanism. Despite making claims for post-genderism and gender liberation, transhumanism reinscribes the humanist and human-centric diagram of control, its logic of colonization, and its instrumentalized conception of techne vis-a-vis logos. So the rationale for an alternative diagram of control emerges when understanding the limitations of the first mastery subjugation model of relationality. The second diagram of humans on the loop, HOL, thus deprioritizes human centrism and offers an alternative conception, rejecting atomism and underscoring the affinities between human animals, non-human animals, and machines. I would say that third wave feminisms have taken up the mantle of questioning the legitimacy of the master diagram of power by questioning nature-culture dichotomies and the human-centric diagram of humans as agents, superior subjects, and primarily cultural beings in view of a universal nature. Humans would be viewed as being on the loop with non-humans, that is, co-producers under specific but changing environmental conditions that are conceptualized as being both within and beyond human control. For example, criticizing the scientific imagery that segregates species and privileges human-centric forms of life, critical posthumanists are arguing for a rejection of the principle of human mastery in favor of conceptualization that bridges the divide between human and non-human lives. In this regard, the HOL diagram of control is deeply connectionist. The emphasis on connectionism is intended to deprioritize strong anthropocentrism as a way of overturning the in-the-loop human as master narrative of control. Whereas the mastery model, HIL, makes humans the creator and controller of technological change, connectionist or HOL orientations would claim that the human is an open-ended category and the product of ongoing processes of collective biosociotechnical individuation. For instance, Rosie Braidotti has argued, quote, life, far from being codified as the exclusive property or the unalienable right of one species, the human, is posited as processual, interactive, and open-ended, the transversal force that cuts across and reconnects previously segregated species, categories, and domains. This vital interconnection posits a qualitative shift of the relationship away from speciesism toward an ethical appreciation of what bodies, human, animal, others, can do. The new transversal alliance across species and among post-human subjects opens up unexpected possibilities for the recomposition of communities and for the very idea of humanity and for ethical forms of belonging, end quote. In a similar vein, Cynthia Willett has argued, quote, the biosocial processes of living matter challenge the atomistic individualism of classic liberal state of nature theories more radically than one may first think. We are not naturally frozen into genetically defined groups with clear and distinct boundaries, but for the same reasons, we are not individual atoms either. Rather than in individuals or groups, we function at times like nodes in multi-species networks and selves in multi-species communities, end quote. Now, contrary to transhumanist feminists who seek to accelerate the technological transformation of the human, post-humanist feminisms decenter the human and make it cede its will to dominate. Whereas the first diagram of control is strongly human-centered, binary, and hierarchical, the second diagram undoes human-centrism in an effort to open up multiple pathways and possibilities of relationality between humans and non-humans. So, for example, Willett's concept of interspecies ethics also emphasizes the limitations of the liberal model of human agency. Quote, a post-humanist lens ventures beyond modern and postmodern binaries, as in sympathy for the other, to engage multi-layered symbiotic agencies and biosocial communities. Ethics does not depend on any unique human capacities for propositional language or rational argument. The use of a rational argument or a system of rules, say, to render norms consistent within and across communities of practices, may contribute to fairness, but also risks introducing rigidity in the weave of improvised connections and cross-modal correspondences underneath abstract and otherwise decontextualized rules, end quote. That's all Willett. So, criticizing human-centrism and its emphasis on hierarchy and mastery, HOL perspectives emerged to offer a different diagram of control, in which humans share control with non-humans. Here, the emphasis on posthumanism rather than on humanism is meant to deprioritize HIL narratives in favor of HOL viewpoints that privilege interspecies coevolution and co-production. HOL perspectives emphasize post-anthropocentrism and posthumanism as a way of overturning humanism's human as master model. Whereas HIL makes humans the creator and controller of technological change, the posthumanist-oriented HOL would claim, as I said, that the human should remain open-ended, a product of ongoing processes of technological and anthropological, that is, biological and cultural development. Paraphrasing Gilbert Simondon, the inextricability of human and technical realities suggests that the established opposition between culture and nature, human and machine, is not only easily subverted, but ultimately so falsifiable that it can be technically manipulated so as to shed light on a dimension that remains indiscernible to humanism. That is, that it is by way of technical objects and technical existence that human beings most authentically relate to their living milieu and to living processes. So outside the humanist schema of the logos, of words, reasons, and rationalizations, established oppositions such as nature and culture, humanity and technicity, mind and body, animal and machine, find themselves reticulated, interconnected, as elements within a technical network of ongoing modifications, which Simondon characterizes as being in a constant and constitutive process of transduction. The human, as such, is an ongoing product and outcome of psychotechnical modifications. Now, arguably, this is the viewpoint that is challenging the HIL perspective today, since HOL discourses that emphasize more ecological, cosmopolitical, and egalitarian premises and orientations are attracting attention as positive approaches for imagining alternatives to current planetary futures. As Engbert and Shirkman point out in their introduction to a recent special issue on posthumanism and the renegotiation of nature and culture, the posthuman is not only a position from which to argue, but an analytic resource for gaining alternative perspectives in a field of tension between de- and recentering the human. Quote, while the perspective of the Anthropocene centers human beings and their agency and interventions in geo-epochal transformations through technological developments and biochemical products, posthuman perspectives decenter the idea of humankind being in charge of technical and ideological mastery over nature. We see a new field of research emerging, which appears to renegotiate the relation of nature and culture and the positioning or dissolution of us within posthuman or post-anthropocentric approaches, end quote. Connectionist, relational, critical, HOL perspectives such as these are especially significant to discussions of ethical AI and could be incorporated much more explicitly and emphatically into current global debates, especially in order to propose alternatives to the prevailing human-centered paradigm of AI. The incorporation of post-humanistic discourses would be especially useful, I would think, of supplementing current evaluations and speculations about the actual or potential risks and benefits of AI by introducing questions of how AI technologies influence and reorganize power relations, and how the norms of emergent governability may be shaped by visible and invisible power relations that may in fact worsen rather than solve global inequalities and injustices. But vestiges of anthropocentrism remain in HOL perspectives, since an emphasis on co-evolution and co-production does not necessarily entail ceding human oversight altogether. Despite many of its appealing features, then, HOL still tends towards human exceptionalism and preserves commitments to human-centrism. True, anthropocentrism is especially difficult to overturn completely when the intellectual resources that we have come from histories that are deeply embedded in humanistic ideas that define humans as unique in relation to others. As I've mentioned, while in theory it may be possible, in practice, the strict distinctions between HIL and HOL perspectives are hard to maintain, as ethical perspectives of every kind tend to find refuge in humanistic, human-centric ideals that promise a special status and role for humans, whether as well-meaning stewards or custodians of non-humans. Neither HIL nor HOL perspectives, even the more critical alternatives, can claim to have explained why humans should expect to be exemplary amongst other non-human entities. So while HOL might decenter the human, I don't see how it can strongly defend its claim of being post-anthropocentric. Because standard posthumanism does not sever or abolish the distinctions between human and non-human. This diagram of control as such tends towards weak anthropocentrism. So the human out of the loop, or HOOL model, is the final diagram of control. The one, I would argue, that theoretically eliminates human-centrism. Since there are few ontological and epistemological resources that are not somehow connected to human-centrism, this last diagram would require speculative rather than normative thinking about xeno intelligences well beyond human parameters. And as such, conceptualizing non-anthropocentrism may require going beyond empirical and normative analyses to a level of speculation disconnected from the is and oughts of more human-centered approaches. The question of governance in the specter of non-anthropocentrism would have to entertain possibilities that are not defined by the capacities and powers of the human-non-human divide. This is where most contemporary thinking fails to provide an adequate framework. So this final diagram of control is marked by a big question mark, the unknown, agnostos. So for the time being, I suggest we make use of the placeholder, the notion of xeno, an ancient Greek word meaning strange or alien, which might serve as a speculative proxy for framing that which replaces human-centrism and which would therefore truly be post-anthropocentric. Accordingly, the HOOL model, the out-of-the-loop model, could be provisionally called a non-standard or perhaps even a speculative posthumanism. The latter term being one that was coined by philosopher David Rodin, who advances a disconnection thesis, suggesting that humans should not be conceptualized in terms of the presence or absence of some essential human property. In other words, not as Lockean or Kantian persons, but as, quote, an emergent disconnection between individuals that should not be conceived in narrow biological terms, but in wide terms, permitting biological, cultural, and technological relations of descent between human and post-human. Instead of positing any anthropocentric baseline, not even a weakly constrained one, the disconnectionist model would begin with the assumption that our current technical practice could precipitate a non-human world that we can't yet understand, in which our values may have no place. So speculative posthumanism as such, as Rodin says, need not introduce any normative justifications, moral or otherwise, since the possibility of posthumans implies that the future of life and mind might not only be stranger than what we imagined, but stranger than we can currently conceive. So in addition to the more conservative, precautionary, and or more therapeutic or critical approaches currently available that favor human-centric premises and solutions to varying degrees, discussions of ethics and gender could be supplemented with more speculative questions, especially in relation to alternative questions of humanity, in which human-centrism is marginal, if at best. Here, human would not refer primarily to the human-centric portrait equated with biological and cognitive embodiments, i.e. neither as real organism nor as the phenomenological self that has subjective experiences, but to a view that is disconnected and independent of any human-centrism. Such speculative resources may help in conceptualizing alternatives to anthropocentric models. Queer theorist Jose Munoz, however, aptly captures the problem of thinking outside the regime of the human. Quote, thinking outside the regime of the human is simultaneously exhilarating and exhausting. It is a ceaseless endeavor, a continuous straining to make sense of something else that is never fully knowable. The radical attempt to think incommensurate queer inhumanity is a denaturalizing and unsettling of the settled, sedimented, and often ferocious world of recalcitrant anti-humanism. Queer thought is, in large part, about casting a picture of arduous modes of relationality that persist in the world despite stratifying demarcations and taxonomies of being, classifications that are bent on the siloing of particularity and on the denigrating of any expansive idea of the common and communism, end quote. Here, the turn to relationality in the last instance, even one that is arduous, belies, I would argue, a crypto-human-centrism that ultimately turns queerness's non-standard potential for post-anthropocentrism against itself, returning it to a state of weak anthropocentrism. Instead, I would say that the queer labor of the xeno diagram demands thinking not in terms of relation, but rather non-relation and disconnection from standard modes of being and thinking. In this regard, object-oriented feminisms, OOF, and xenofeminisms, XF, are two contemporary discourses that, like standard posthumanisms, are based on the affirmation of technomaterialities, anti-naturalism, and intersectionality. But unlike the standard posthumanisms found under the on-the-loop diagram of control, both OOF and XF are based on cutting ties with ideals like subjectivity and agency, focusing instead on non-standard notions of withdrawal without emergence, objects without subjects, alienation without agency, and gender abolition instead of gender essentialism or gender performativity. For example, Catherine Behar is critical of standard object-oriented ontology for remaining silent about the tensions between feminism, i.e. the critique of female objectification, and object orientation. Behar points out that OOO privileges liveliness and connectivity, which is problematic, quote, because the imperative to connect is detrimental to individuals who suffer from the overconnection compulsions of neoliberal subjectivity, end quote. The withdrawal of the object, its self-containedness, is viewed as a kind of objection qua resistance. Quote, OOO's conception, again Behar, quoting Behar, OOO's conception of objects as fundamentally withdrawn and self-contained resonates with feminist objects that resist us and the feminist notion that as objects, we resist, end quote. Yet instead of connection, what is offered is commonality and continuity. Quote, our common status as matter makes way for continuity between all objects, whether human or non-human, organic or inorganic, animate or inanimate, unquote. Likewise, building on Laboria Cubonics's xenofeminist manifesto, Helen Hester names 4 technological principles of XF: circumnavigation of gatekeepers, repurposing, scalability, and intersectionality. Quote, through these principles, the master's tools can dismantle the master's house, end quote. While such posthumanisms go beyond trying to decenter agency and strongly renounce the humanistic ontotheologies at the heart of the master diagram of power, and this act of refusal is significant and necessary, theoretically, the attempt to bring about new configurations of relationality/continuity based on alter ontologies loosens anthropocentrism, but does not eliminate it altogether. Case in point, Hester's suggestion that the master's tools can dismantle the master's house threatens to extend mastery as the driving force of XF's technological mandate. Ultimately, queer, xenofeminist, and object-oriented feminisms are in danger of reverting to the standard posthumanisms insofar as they do not abandon connectionism, whether strong or weak, prioritizing relation, communication, continuity, and exchangeability, thus operationalizing the age-old standard of defining at least 2 terms and the differences that connect them. As Michelle Liu reminds us, abolitionism does not equal posthumanism. Quote, these procedures of making equal, calculable, and knowable are articulated in processes of converting worlds into the grammars of the human. An end of the human would be nothing less than abolitionist, end quote. Rather than recuperating abolitionist and decolonial thought for a relational standard, the out-of-the-loop diagram, or what I'm calling the xeno diagram, is concerned first and foremost with thinking about how to incapacitate the conceptual and structural apparati of relation that makes distinction possible. Post-anthropocentrism, it would seem, requires a reckoning with the end of the human. Disconnection and non-relation, in other words, become important concepts to consider when making claims about post-anthropocentrism. Lewis stresses, quote, the continuing damage of the human as an invention of the Western philosophical tradition, suggesting that its orders of transcendence, overcoming, and resolution proceed in philosophies of relation and difference that lacerate into rivenness and vanish by equivalency, a structural violence that is at once constitutive and irreparable. Quote, the human is a transcendental formation cut into being through procedures of an injurious and enduring philosophical colonization that correlates Blackness with the non-human and indigeneity with the non-sovereign, end quote. Sorry, not end quote, remained quoted. Underlying liberal orders of consensus and being in common are structures of relations that constitute a carceral thought world, end quote. So where abolitionist thought elicits an end of a carceral paradigm, which the post-human may also inhabit, posthumanism may leave intact the racial, sexual, colonial, ontological underpinning of the human, the master diagram of control. So Lew declares that within the terms of this world, the demands of the non-human cannot be met. So in conclusion, as much as we talk and obsess about transhumans, posthumans, and xeno futures, we are, as someone once put it, still human all too human. It takes a lot to even desire to think outside the regime of the human. What has been called post-anthropocentrism really ends up getting caught in the backdraft of anthropocentrism, however weakly. Post-anthropocentrism ought to be non-anthropocentric. I've suggested that in this presentation, that non-anthropocentrism entails disconnection with human-centrism. Without such a move, declarations of so-called post-anthropocentrism end up being caught in the endless differential circuits of human-centrism. Along with disconnection and non-relation, the third diagram of humans out of the loop, or non-anthropocentrism, also requires a rethinking of incommensurability. The xeno diagram is, after all, a speculation about what it is impossible to know anthropocentrically. Thinking about the end of the human has to be rethought as a kind of knowing that is incommensurable, as Lew says, or as Munoz puts it, quote, to think the inhuman is the necessary queer labor of the incommensurate. The fact that this thing we call the inhuman is never fully knowable because of our own stuckness within humanity makes it a kind of knowing that is incommensurable with the protocols of human knowledge production. Despite the incommensurability, this seeming impossibility, one must persist in thinking in these inhuman directions. Once one stops doing the incommensurate work of attempting to touch inhumanity, one loses traction and falls back onto the predictable coordinates of a relationality that announces itself as universal, but is in fact only a substratum of the various potential interlays of life within which one is always inculcated. I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nandita. This was at some point I wrote down in my notebook and also in the chat that it felt like some sort of detective in which we were, digging deeper and deeper into these, three fantastic diagrams that you presented to us, and we were all kind of in a way longing for learning, more about the third diagram of HOOL. So to open up the floor for questions and points of discussion, I would really like to encourage everyone to either raise your hand or write something in the chat, either here on Zoom or through YouTube. And the YouTube channel is being looked after by Zach. Yeah, so just to invite participants here to raise their hand.
It looks like people were shocked to see no PowerPoint. That's funny. Only funny because this is exactly what we were talking about right before the talk, how I went very old school and I have no images. And so I'm sorry that, there were no images to accompany this presentation. But partly, let's say that, as I was saying earlier, it's because I wanted to sort of highlight the gestural aspect of what I was saying, as opposed to the volatile aspect, as opposed to focusing on signs and inscriptions. But the truth is that I didn't have time to put a PowerPoint together. So
I think, you ended so beautifully with, the incommensurability and ending this, trying to end this this human desire to think or imagine or even touch. I think at some point you said the inhuman. So I think it was more than just, not having time. I think we can really read this as something that, accompanies your thinking also theoretically. So I do see a hand, Jacob van Geest. Please ask your question.
Hi, Nandita. Thank you so much for your talk. I'll need a copy of it for sure. But I have a question sort of about this incommensurability and how it plays with sort of these various theories, xenofeminism, object-oriented feminism. So you talked about the out of the loop, the human out of the loop as a mode of speculation. And so this act of speculation tries to get us outside of human knowledges and human ways of thinking. But even when we speculate, we remain epistemological, we remain ontological in our speculations, insofar as, like, at least in our traditions, we're categorical thinkers, and these are the categories that we think of, and these become sort of impossible to escape. So I'm wondering if even in the incommensurability that occurs in these attempts at the speculation of a non-standard post-humanism, whether we can only think about this in terms of something like a problematic rather than something that is solvable. So that, and what I mean by that is that at each stage, it's like we peel back some layer away from this human-centric perspective, we get a little closer, but then it's each time reinscribed into the humanism, right? So we get at the xeno, but then, we realize, we're still epistemological in the xeno. We're still working within the human category. And I wonder if thinking about this in terms of perpetual displacement works more than thinking about it in terms of a solution, and that whether if thinking about it in terms of a problematic rather than a solution, we sort of also displace that human desire for solutions.
Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say that in many ways, what Morozov calls solutionism, that is in the loop. That's an in the loop way of thinking. So yeah, maybe thinking in terms of problematics is one way of pursuing a different trajectory. But one of the things I really want to caution against, and this is why I made such a hullabaloo of talking about diagrams as suggestive and gestures rather than prescriptions, is that I don't mean to suggest that all attempts at moving beyond the in the loop, could be, in other words, I don't mean to use this analytic as a way of making prescriptive judgments. However, I should say, and maybe you'll help me with this, Jacob, there is a way I think that what I didn't do today is talk about the politics of each of these categories. So there is the politics of HIL, there is the politics of HOL, and maybe, although we can't talk about the politics of HOOL, we can certainly talk about the politics of disconnection and non-relation that are the necessary preconditions for going into that xeno diagram of power. So there is a way, I think, to use this as a way to then map out the politics of all these things. But I have not done that myself yet today. But I think that I will have to do that. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to do that is because that way we can start to see really how standard posthumanisms can be. And part of my aim today was just to gesture on, some of the more, contemporary radical theories that we talk about, in fact, sound an awful lot like first wave feminisms, in some sense. And so today I just gave you a little taste of that. And I think that this can be iterated in many different ways. And I do intend to think more about the politics that go within each of these three diagrams of power. But today, I just want to talk about them as diagrams. Because if I talk about them as anything other than that, then it becomes a bit straitjacketing. And then it becomes very difficult to say, oh, this belongs in this, and then actually this belongs in this category. You know what I mean? This way, by keeping it a bit contingent, I can show you that even the ones that aim to be in that last category, somehow they make moves, theoretical moves, that actually associate them with the previous two categories. So they have to be very careful. And Catherine Behar is a friend of mine. I love her work. In fact, I place myself in HOL. That is, when I think about my Nietzschean roots, if I guess he would hate to be called roots of anything, but when I think of my Nietzschean proclivities and my interest in thinkers like Simondon, really, I'm still in that middle category, but that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, in the sense that though that category is a necessary category, that actually does loosen anthropocentrism, I think, although it's not post-anthropocentric. So, Simondon never makes that claim of being post-anthropocentric. So I don't really have any, I don't have any problem with Simondon in that sense. But there are theorists that I have put in that middle category that do make that claim. And so for me, the post-anthropocentric it's a little bit too quick, and it certainly doesn't belong in that middle category, I don't think. I hope I've answered somewhat, or responded, but it is a good question. It is true that solutionism, these aren't solutions. None of this is a solution. And I would never, ever use that kind of framework to describe what I think is the potential of this analytic that I've presented today.
So, to me, this was really an answer. I don't know, Jacob, how you would respond to Nandita's question, but I have in a way a follow-up question that has something to do with the notion. I think it's a creative concept of the gesture. And I put in the chat, I put a reference or the link to a text that is titled Unruly Gestures, 7 paragraphs on reading, writing practices in our post-digital condition by Janneke Adema and Camilla Kuch. I think it was published in Culture Unbound maybe 2 years ago. And they theorize this idea of the gesture. And I wanted to ask if gesture indeed is for you a theoretical tool or a critical creative concept.
I don't know how to answer that, Iris, but let me tell you that, first of all, I'm a dancer. A lot of people know that. A lot of people don't know that. But since I see a lot of names from the South Asian world, I don't mind saying that actually I'm trained in Indian classical dance since the age of 6. And in fact, right now I'm missing my dance class because I'm doing this presentation. But so all that to say that gesture, which is at the heart of the art form that I practice, it is all important. And so I think, yes, I mean, for me, there is a lot to still excavate in the notion of gesture. As a practitioner of gesture, I think I'm just only beginning to theorize its potential. Having been thoroughly trained in post-structuralism myself, I'm still trying to, in some senses, divest myself of the kind of like the kind of domain of the sign, under which I was trained. So, in some senses, yes, gesture for me is something extremely theoretically important and has a lot of potential. And so thank you for providing this source, because I think that right now I'm still working through Châtelet, and also I get my theory of gesture from Schwaller de Lubitsch, who was a very strange, wonky Egyptologist. And so, again, very interdisciplinary. So, but yes, I would say that, yes, I put a lot of theoretical weight on gesture. And I think I still have to build a lot theoretically there. But to me, this is a very promising avenue.
That's very nice to hear. Also, because you just used the word interdisciplinarity, and in these lectures of the School for Materialist Research, I've always asked the speakers about their relation to interdisciplinarity as a practice, and maybe a theory of interdisciplinarity, whether that is popping up in your work. So that would be my follow-up question then immediately.
It's funny. So 2 words, I always highlight interdisciplinarity. I have since I started my master's, oh gosh, 20, 25, 30 years ago now. So it's always been an important thing for me. And that's why, in some senses, although I don't mention it all that often, even thinkers like de Certeau, still remain treasure troves for me. And so in my current work on warfare, larval warfare in particular, I really go back to de Certeau's practices of everyday life, right? But it's not just interdisciplinarity that I find important. It's also transdisciplinarity, because interdisciplinarity suggests, again, a kind of threshold between 2 or more, areas. But transdisciplinarity kind of connotes that, I guess, transversal, movement across these landscapes. That is a slightly different move. So interdisciplinary, yes, and transdisciplinary, yes. And that's why I have found it really, there's no theory of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinarity that I espouse to, because for me, transdisciplinarity is empirical. It's what you do, and so I don't really, the theory can come afterwards. The doing comes first, right? So doing transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity has always been all important for me. And I think that partly accounts for why I'm always kind of a strange externality anywhere, even in my, my department is a wonderful place and I have great colleagues. But I literally sometimes have colleagues who tell me, I have no idea what you do. I'm glad you're doing it, but I have no idea what you do. So I think that, there is a way in which, in my experience, at least, to do work in an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary way requires, in some senses, seemingly a kind of peripherality, like you may not cross through the center, right? You might have to cross at the margins. And so there's a marginality too that has been really important for me to cultivate in order to do this work. It kind of is very important for my point of view not to occupy the center. And I think that's the only way I can get that choreographic movement across these three categories that I've talked about today.
And do you think that this empirical research that you do, this transdisciplinary empirical research, helps you reach the third diagram?
No.
Or is it the second the second diagram where that kind of research is situated?
I'd say that probably, if I had to say, the research I've produced is probably best situated in that middle diagram. But I think there's always something in my research that longs for that third diagram. So, for example, the piece that I published in Katerina's book on kind of feminist thinking of speculative realism, that piece, in some senses, it didn't really provide, or it didn't have theoretical sources that I would consider in that third category. But I tried to do something with those sources that somehow problematized my place in that second category. So I think that, like Munoz, the quote I ended this presentation with, even if I'm not in that third category, I'm going to still try. I'm going to still write, because writing is already, straight jackets us in many ways within that first and second diagram. But so I think the work of the incommensurate is something that that's probably where my labor will be found, now and in the near future.
I really, sympathize, although that's, also a second diagram kind of thing to say, I learned with everything that you're saying at the moment. And I was, during your talk, as I was, trying to reach that third diagram in my head already, I was thinking at some point about a recent book that came out. It's called The Post-Human Pandemic. And it tries to think about pandemic together with art and art theory. And maybe where indeed this third diagram could be found is where the authors say things like both the virus and art, not all art, but specific examples, defy classification. That's maybe what you are saying, that this is maybe how chapters ended, and what chapters were, to use your language, gesturing to.
And I think that's where I have to now take this and now talk about the politics of this third xeno diagram. And I think that's where, yes, the kind of critical art performative practices you're talking about, I think that's where they would come in for sure. So yeah, there's a whole lot that I haven't talked about today. And I think that your question kind of highlights to me that there's still more that I need to do. And in fact, I am thinking about this as a book where, the idea is that you'd have a chapter devoted to each of these so that really you can get into both the theoretical articulation as well as the politics of that theoretical articulation. And I think that would really enhance this overall analytic that I've only presented, the first part to you today.
I was hoping that it was going to be a book, so in that sense, I'm very happy. I wanted to ask the other participants here in the Zoom or the ones looking at the YouTube chat to formulate their questions. Chris, please.
Hey, Nandita, thanks so much for your riveting presentation. As Iris said, indeed, it was really a sort of a detective, and I really also empathically sort of identify with this striving that you're talking about, sort of how to move beyond that incommensurable border of our own humanity and its history. But my question is maybe a bit more sort of towards the loops themselves that you're describing. So obviously, in the sort of AI discourse, to my mind, human in the loop would also have a positive association, as much of the technology is being implemented exactly with us outside of the loop, or so much automated that all kinds of mayhem are resulting, right? And then I'm wondering about the stakes that you're kind of entering into with this sort of non-human heap that we're either looped into, onto, or not a part of, right? And then we have, let's say, physical, biological, and technological, we might say, categories within that heap. And it seems to me that you're allowing these all to blend, or all to be part of that same heap, which to my mind might only be definable in terms of a non-human heap, exactly, right? Whereas, and this is a personal sort of hang-up of mine also, whereas one might argue that the technological, of course, is an extension of human agency. So to my mind, there's sort of a tangle occurring there in the definition of technology vis-a-vis, let's say, other non-human or more than human phenomena that we might identify. So I was wondering if you could expand a little on your using of this metaphor coming from sort of tech discourse and the role of technology vis-a-vis, let's say, environmental or ecological agents, and the xeno that we might distinguish in the sci-fi, speculative, or technological axis vis-a-vis a more, let's say, earthly xeno.
Yeah, and I think, in order to give you a satisfying answer, I would have to talk about the politics within each of those categories. So I think the fact that I haven't done that is probably, partly the reason why you probably are feeling dissatisfied about these categories. So let me just say that, yes, the idea of using this for the purposes that I did, the application that I put to this terminology is very different from the way the terminology has been developed in robotics and applied to various domains like warfare. So you're right. I mean, and partly this did come out of an observation that, on the one hand, we seem to be still within a kind of like HIL paradigm, but at the same time, we are being phased out as humans in favor of off the loop, systems. But still, I think it makes sense to think about that in the way that I've already described, because within our world right now, although a lot is being, or the human, let's say, is being phased out, and I mean the humanist human is being phased out, in some senses, it has also, in fact, reinforced the humanist perspective of technology as something which we use to transform ourselves. So the transhumanist vision of technological acceleration and augmentation, I would say, is still humanistic, ironically, because it doesn't see technology or techne as anything other than a handmaid to the human. That's why I think the middle diagram, HOL, is important. It is so important because I think that critical, feminist, post-humanist thinkers have, in fact, moved toward a different model where technology is no longer just an instrument. It is something that we entangle our being with. And so, again, Simondon is very interesting. We talk about the mode of existence of technical objects. It's only because we have that second diagram that we can do that. That's very different from saying, well, we can use technology to transform ourselves. And even if that, in some senses, takes us off the loop, that's still going to, in some senses, that off the loopedness is going to be in service of human transformation. That's very different than what, post-humanist, materialist philosophers say. So that's why, I think that still I would maintain that this analytic is actually useful in distinguishing between transhumanism, which I think is in the loop, and post-humanist and xenofeminist ideas, which and kind of materialist ideas of matter as being entangled, which is very different. That's like a different ontological model, I would say. The problem is that these diagrams are an analytic because it's only, in the world of thinking that I can put these into three very distinct categories. Of course, in life, that is not possible to do. And these categories overlap with one another in actual practices and politics that either transhumanist, xenofeminist, what have you. So I know this may not be a satisfying answer, but I think there is a usefulness. There's a heuristic ability in this diagram to at least maneuver within. And yes, I think that adding the various politics within each of these, and in so doing, situating all of the kind of various praxis that we currently have that are trying to respond to this messiness that we're all in, right? So again, a lot more work to do, but I find it potentially useful in helping parse out some ways in which we think, okay, so we think we're being post-humanist, but then sometimes we are actually having one foot back in that last diagram. We also have another foot in the third diagram. And so really, I think it's very hard to avoid this amplification, between this bleeding between the three. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot. That really helped me already to start to populate with you politically, yeah, your diagrams. Thanks.
And you know, populating, that's a very interesting, that's exactly what I mean. It is really about using these three diagrams to populate your own content, really, in some senses, and then to help you parse out various positionalities, as well as their interaction across these diagram and their boundaries.
Thank you so much, Chris, for a great question. Just asking again, and also, you know, this is maybe also the time to, should there be something in the live chat to make that public, and to make sure that Nandita also knows what is going on there.
Yeah, there's no questions in the live stream right now.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah.
Thanks, Zach. Well, I mean, I please, you know, if you have a question, you can always get in touch with me, and I would be delighted to, you know, interlocute and speak further. But really, I am so grateful to SMR for, you know, giving me this opportunity to put some of my thoughts, which literally they were sometimes, you know, flitting around for the past 5 years, you know, kind of. And so I think, you know, I found it very helpful. So thank you. And again, as I say, if you have questions, I invite you to contact me. You can always find my email at the University of Western Ontario in the Department of Political Science. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nandita. That's very generous. I think the talk itself was also very generous and also very generative. I you know, it's I kind of have the same feeling as Chris, or I'm going through the same process of thinking with, you know, the diagram. So I think, yeah, I think it will really be a great contribution that we're also waiting for. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us and on behalf of the school. This was really wonderful, and I wish you a great remainder of your Sunday. I'm so sorry you couldn't go to dance class, but luckily this was generative as well.
Oh, that's quite all right. And I thank all of you as well. Thank you for your great questions. And I wish you all the best from Chile, Canada to wherever you all are. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.